Okay, so welcome again. My name is Etta King. I'm the Education Program Manager here at the Jewish Women's Archive. And today we're going to be talking about Purim and specifically about Queen Esther and a modern woman, Bella Abzug. But first, I want to just tell you a little bit about the Jewish Women's Archive. So, our mission is to document Jewish women's stories, elevate their voices, and inspire them to be agents of change. And as teachers, you are essential partners in that work. So, we make these resources available to you. We do as much as we can through our professional development programs and the National Educators Network to support teachers like you who are out in the field. But we couldn't do the work of our mission without you. And so I want to take this opportunity to thank you all for the part that you play. And I also want to say something about sort of the crux of our educational work, which is our former deputy director used to say, students cannot be what they cannot see. So our work is a lot about providing students with a wide variety of role models, incorporating women in the stories that we tell about ourselves as the American Jewish community, and also thinking about women who come from all different walks of life and people who come from all different walks of life, not just the famous ones or the ones who were particularly and most notably courageous. So we want to give students a wide variety of role models and use the stories of those role models to help students think about themselves and their community critically in order to shape and build an inclusive Jewish future. Before we jump into the content of the session, I also want to make mention of this opportunity for those of you who are working with students who are in 6th through 12th grade. Each year we give the Natalia Torsky Educator Award to a teacher who creatively uses primary sources to integrate the stories of Jewish women into their classroom and share those stories with students and sort of critically analyze them and grapple with the primary sources. So we have more information about this on the website. Miriam will also put a link in the chat to the Tversky landing page if you want to check out more about the submission guidelines or see past submissions. And I just want to make mention of, we're not going to spend a lot of time looking at this lesson plan today, but the 2012 winner named Allison Matana, who's pictured here, created a lesson that combined a study of the Purim story with the stories of some modern Jewish women labor activists and sort of looking at different models for making change and how Esther and Vashti provide those different models. So that's also a cool Purim resource to check out that we're not going to focus on today. So 3 goals that I sort of want to lay out for this workshop. And I want to say that we're going to spend some time on the Purim story, but not a lot of time. I think there are a lot of resources out there for educating yourself about the Purim story and thinking creatively about how to tell that story to your students. What we're really going to do here is think about what's another layer that we can put on top of that, especially for students who are a little bit older, meaning like 5th grade and up, thinking about how to bring in something about themselves and a new layer of understanding, and specifically looking at sort of gender and identity and leadership and thinking about how we present ourselves and how we look helps us be leaders, helps us get power, and also what that says about who we are and sort of the inside versus the outside, and thinking about appearance in that way. And this content is taken directly from our Go and Learn collection. There's a lesson about this. So at the end, you'll have some background information in this session and get some sense of how we model doing text study and things like that. And then you can actually take this lesson plan and teach it in your classroom or adapt it for your community. And there are 3 different lesson plans as part of the Purim guide. So there's one for youth, which is middle school and high school, one for family education, and one for adult education. So for those of you who either are looking for these resources or know other colleagues who are, this is a great place to come. So rather than telling you all the Purim story, I think probably some of you have a little bit more nuance and know a little bit more about how to do this. So I just wanted to sort of crowdsource a basic timeline of the Purim story together. So where does the story, I'm asking you all to either unmute your mic and let us know or type in the chat, and let's just throw out a basic timeline of the story. So how does the story start? And this is always a little bit tricky on in the virtual setting, but our webinars are really interactive, so I'm going to be asking a lot of participation from you all today. Okay, so a king in Persia is unhappy with his wife. Marilyn starts the story. Excellent. So yes, King Ahasuerus is unhappy, and Lynn Ann is saying it usually starts with Vashti. So yeah, it starts with Vashti. She's the queen, and the king. Sorry, the king is unhappy with her in some way. Let's say a little bit more about Vashti, and you know, sort of why do we start the story with her? I think it's important context. Great, I see a bunch of people are typing in. Right, so the king asks, it sounds like somebody maybe Lynn Ann, you wanted to say something out loud?
Oh, I was going to say that her dismissal is what starts the search for the new queen.
Yeah, so, and Elaine is backtracking a little bit, so thank you. So it starts with this. Lynn Ann, maybe when you're not talking, you could mute yourself or plug in. Great. Yeah, so it starts with this big party. King Ahasuerus throws a big party, and he tells Vashti, you know, I want you to come to this party. And she doesn't want to. She thinks that it's wrong for him to call her at that time, and she refuses. And there's a lot of different readings of, you know, was he asking her to come naked? What, you know, sort of why she refuses it in that moment. And there are a lot of, you could do a whole lesson plan just on Vashti and not even get to the rest of the story. So she refuses, and it starts this search for a new queen. And so all of the eligible virgins in the area are sort of called, and several of them are selected. They spend a year sort of beautifying themselves. So I have this picture, a painting by Edwin Long, that I thought really captured that. And they sort of have this like fashion show where the king chooses the one that he feels is most beautiful. And as we know, he picks Esther. So I'm going to jump back to you all now. So let's say a little bit more about how he chooses Esther and what that process is like, and sort of what happens after that. So I've got a couple people typing in, and don't feel, you know, you should feel like whatever you have to contribute here is good. So I know some people sometimes feel like they don't have something to contribute, but this is all good, part of the process. Yeah, so Marilyn is holding up this piece about Esther is Jewish, and she's an orphan. She's been raised by her uncle Mordecai. who hangs out at the castle gates. Yeah, he's sort of a hobnobber, and he always seems to know what's going on. Um, and at the same time as this is going on, as Esther is becoming queen, there's a decree that's passed throughout the land that the Jews will all be killed. And Mordecai hears about this and he comes to Esther. I know I'm skipping over some things, but he comes to Esther and he says, this is really bad, and you as a Jew will not be exempt from this, even though you're queen, and you need to do something. And he asks Esther to go and sort of advocate for the Jewish people, and Esther is really worried about doing that because at the time you can't just go to the king and ask him for things, even if you're the queen, right? You have to be invited. And so what she does is she dresses herself up, and she, gets all gussied up, and she, gets ready, and she comes to the throne room, and she sort of waits. And the king sees her, King Ahasuerus sees her, and he sees how beautiful she is, and he extends his scepter to her and says, please come and tell me what you want. And she says, I actually want to have you and your right-hand man, Haman, who's sort of driving all of the anti-Jewish stuff that's going on because of his relationship with Mordecai. I want to have you to dinner. And as you all know, they come to dinner. She doesn't bring it up right then. She invites them back for another dinner. And ultimately, at one of these dinners, Esther reveals that she, in fact, is Jewish and that Haman wants to kill all the Jews. And if that happens, then she'll also have to die. And Ahasuerus changes his mind, and the Jews win. That's the basic plot summary. If you feel like I missed something or there are other points you want to raise, please type into the chat. And so there's a lot in this story, and this lesson plan specifically sort of focuses on what does it mean, or what can we understand about the story and about sort of beauty and power from the way that Esther is portrayed. So I want to jump to you all for some discussion questions now, and this is where your involvement is really important. But just sort of looking at these first two questions, at the point where she becomes queen, and then also at the point where she sort of comes to the throne room to ask the king for a meeting, do we think that Esther is courageous, and how does her sort of beauty play into the factor or the process of becoming queen? Let's explore that a little bit. So do we think that this is a courageous act, and do we think that leveraging your beauty is a good way to get power? What do you all think? Yeah, so Marilyn typing in and saying she's not sure how it plays out these days, but in the story, at least, her beauty does give her power. And maybe thinking about what that says about the world then and the world now. What about the second question? Do we think at the part where Esther goes back to the king, I'll go back to that mosaic. So at this part of the story where she goes to the king, do we think that Esther is being courageous in this moment? What do you think? So Marilyn saying she's kind of guilted into it by Mordecai, but yes, it does take some chutzpah. So I like that you raised that up, Marilyn, about being guilted into it. An important thing to think about is sort of what are the factors that influence us to take action. sometimes it's a person saying, I can't do this, I really need you to do it. So maybe teasing that out would be one great extension of this conversation. Samara saying, I think she's doing something that she perceives as difficult and it takes courage to do that. Yeah, and there was some real personal risk. Like, it's pretty clear that Ahasuerus is like a whimsical guy, right? He's doing whatever people tell him to do, basically, and that there's risk in that. And uh, and yeah, and that's I think what Elaine is adding here. And there's also something maybe about overcoming fear. So thinking about the when we're making change, the battles that we sort of have to wage externally, and also the internal battles that we have to wage in order to do that. All of this is great. And Aaron raising the question, wasn't the punishment for appearing before the king without being summoned death? And yes, I believe that's what's laid out in the story anyway. This is great. I'm going to throw up a couple other questions. Do we think that Esther is being manipulative in these moments where she's using her beauty, or being strategic? So thinking about those two different words. So manipulative or strategic. I see a bunch of people are writing in, so I'm excited to see. So in times of need, you need to do what you need to do, Marilyn is saying. But so it could be both. So they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. Naomi saying she also is likely afraid that if she's found out to be Jewish, would she be in trouble for hiding it? Yeah, that's another layer. I'm glad you brought that up. That's another layer here, that she has to think about herself, and also as a leader, you have to think about yourself and about that power, because if something happens to her, even if she's not killed, but maybe if she's deposed, or she doesn't have the power of the queen anymore, she loses the opportunity to protect her community. So thinking about your own identity and how other people are perceiving you in order to keep the power that you have is an important sort of thread in this story. Samara writing in to say, I think she's both. Often when someone is being strategic, there is a need to manipulate the situation to achieve the strategic goal. Yeah, and I think that this question of manipulative or strategic or both is a really great question to tease out with students, learners of all ages. I think it helps us clarify what's going on and also think about how change is made. How is Esther a model for making change? One more question I want to throw in here, which is, what does the story and this sort of conversation about manipulative or strategic tell us about the role or place of women, specifically in the society in which Esther lived? So the sort of consensus here is that she was being strategic by manipulating the situation. What does that say about the place of women? Lynn Ann writing in saying, women took their power where they could find it. Right. This was an opportunity and she was taking it. And there was some pressure from her community through the voice of Mordecai to do that and claim that power, both as a woman and as a Jew. So she's sort of a minority in both ways there. And Marilyn saying she might have to be manipulative or strategic because that was how she could have power. Right. So to parse that out a little bit more, she had to use that because there weren't channels for women to have power in that society, right? A woman, even if she was queen, was really a figurehead. The power that she had was only articulated through the king and through his power. So I think bringing in this question of what does the story teach us about the society is a really important question for adding a deeper layer onto the Purim story, and really thinking about, what does it mean that women or Jews, and we could use this same model in lots of different stories from the holidays that we learn about and teach about. What does it tell us about the society? And then what we can do is we can draw some parallels to our own communities or our own lives and say, how do we make change, and what does that tell us about the structure and the opportunities that are afforded to different people in our community, whether it be women or Jews or young people, and thinking about that. Excellent. So before we jump into the next part, does anyone have any questions or last thoughts on sort of the Purim story aspect? We'll come back to this a little bit more at the end. Okay. If you have any questions as we go on, feel free to jump in the chat or raise your hand. Oh, I do just want to mention, so there are some, I'm sort of focusing on what's common in the 3 different lesson plans for youth, family, and adults. I just want to show you, we're not going to discuss these, but I do want to show you some of the discussion questions from the teen and adult programs. So these discussion questions are starting to take what students have explored in the story and sort of bring that out into their own lives and thinking about how they portray themselves as Jews. There are some questions also about gender and how you dress according to your gender. And so that's sort of where those 2 arrows intersect of like, who was this person and who am I? What did this person do? What do I do? So with no further ado, I want to move on to giving you some background information about an incredible woman and one of my personal possibility models or role models, Bella Abzug. Bella Abzug was born in 1920. Her parents were Russian immigrants, and she was born in the Bronx. And she says that she was born a feminist and that her ideals about feminism really came from her family, especially from her father and her grandfather. So I think it's interesting to me that Bella Abzug is calling out the male adults in her life as her feminist role models. And I should say, I'm giving some background information. We have an extensive amount of information about Bella Abzug, including more photos, audio clips, some video in our online exhibit called Women of Valor. So Miriam will post a link to that in the chat. And as you're thinking about how to bring this story to your students, you can grab whatever you need from that exhibit or from the encyclopedia articles that we have about her. And Abzug came from a religious family. Her grandfather taught her to recite traditional Hebrew prayers. He often took her to a synagogue. And she's actually quoted in our exhibit as saying, "It was during these visits to synagogue that I think I had my first thoughts as a feminist rebel. I didn't like the fact that women were consigned to the back rows of the balcony." So it's really interesting. Here she's saying, several people ask in these programs, what makes this person Jewish and what's Jewish about what they do besides just the fact that they were Jewish. I think it's really interesting to pinpoint this as an awakening for Bella Abzug, that she really learned that from her Jewish community, both her feminist part and the part to be rebellious and to be critical. She learned that in her Jewish community. And when she was 12, her father passed away, and she said the mourner's Kaddish for him, despite the fact that it was the custom. The custom was that sons would say the mourner's Kaddish, and she was very adamant and outspoken about that. And there are some other examples of women who chose to say the mourner's Kaddish for their relatives who passed away. We have a lesson plan about that. So for those of you who are looking at prayer and might want to bring in some further discussions about gender and ritual, we have some other resources for that in Go and Learn. As Bella Abzug got older, she had big ideas about the change that she was going to make in the world. She was the student body president at Hunter College and then ended up at Columbia for law school on a scholarship, though she notes she wanted to go to Harvard Law, but they were not accepting women. And this was at a time, 1942, when less than 3% of all the lawyers in the country were women. So she really was a trailblazer in that sense. And while she was at Columbia, she met the man who became her husband, Martin Abzug. And she speaks a lot about their partnership, which was very equal. Martin played a huge part in raising their children and supporting the work that she did and sort of her vision for the impact that she was going to have on the world. She speaks about this a lot. And it was pretty clear that he had a deep respect for the work that she was doing and really stepped up in a way that was not common at that period of time so that Bella Abzug could do the work that she did. So right out of law school, Bella Abzug started practicing law. She practiced law for 25 years or so. One of her first civil rights cases as the Chief Counsel of Appeals proceedings was in 1950, and it was a really famous case of Willie McGee, who was accused of, he was living in Mississippi and was accused of raping a white woman who he actually had a long standing relationship with, and Bella Abzug was uh, defending him and sort of challenging the traditional practices of excluding blacks from the jury, so he wasn't afforded a trial or a jury of his peers, and also argued that because Southern judges and juries only reserved the death penalty for blacks in cases of rape, it was a cruel and inhuman punishment because the punishment wasn't applied equally to all people. And through these arguments, she managed to get 2 days of execution for him. But on the third time, there was a last minute clemency hearing. Bella Abzug was pregnant at the time. She comes down to Mississippi, and Mississippi was a state of entrenched racism, and sort of like the focal point. It continued to be through the civil rights movement for a lot of testing these cases. And when she showed up at the Jackson bus station, the community was so against her being there and so against the defense of Willie McGee that none of the hotels would let her stay. So she was really stuck. The hotel managers were either racist themselves or afraid of being retaliated against, having violence. And so, pregnant and alone, she locked herself in a bathroom stall and spent the night in the bus station waiting for the hearing the next day. And though he was denied a further stay, and he ultimately, McGee ultimately was given the death sentence and executed, I think that this story, especially because it comes early in her life, is a really good example of Bella Abzug's grit and her commitment to doing what was right and her really broad sense of justice in that way, going beyond her Jewish community, beyond the Northern community, and really beyond the white community, beyond the women's community. She really had a broad sense of what it meant to do the right thing. By the 1960s, the Soviet Union and the US had resumed nuclear testing, and Bella Abzug helped to found Women's Strike for Peace, which she says flowed very naturally into a campaign to get US troops out of Vietnam. And she did a lot of lobbying and led a lot of demonstrations. She really cut her teeth in government and in coalition building during this time. And in 1970, she ran for office. This primary source is one of my favorite things in our whole collection on our website. It says, if you can't read it, it's kind of small. It says, "This woman's place is in the House of Representatives." And here she is wearing one of her iconic hats, which we're going to talk a little bit more about in a second. And she really tossed aside the idea that newcomers to Congress should sort of be quiet and listen and learn. On her first day in office, she introduced a resolution demanding to set a date for withdrawing troops from Vietnam. Many people outside of Congress really saw her as too loud or brash or unwomanly to be effective as a lawmaker. But actually, within Congress, Bella Abzug was a strong coalition builder. So she came from the background of doing this activism in the peace movement. And she also had a mastery of the sort of arcane rules of the House. And she was able to use her mastery of those rules and her background in law and being trained as a lawyer to really weave these brilliant political strategies. And by her third term in office, she was voted as the third most influential person in Congress. So after the Speaker, Carl Albert, and the Majority Whip, Tip O'Neill, the next most influential person in Congress was Bella Abzug. And I think that speaks very highly also to the way that Bella Abzug made change. It wasn't about, though many people saw her as aggressive, it wasn't about pushing her agenda, no matter what anyone else thought. It was really about weaving relationships and about staying committed to her core values. Any questions about Bella Abzug before we look at a little excerpt of an interview with her? Yeah, so Marilyn's writing in saying she was also a quote unquote big woman, tall and broad and loud, so, which brings up a different side of the manipulative or strategic question. She used what she had. And I think, Marilyn, you also made a comment at the beginning when I was showing the different pictures, artistic representations of Esther. It's interesting also to look at different kinds of beauty, or how the way that we look gives us power or gives us less power in certain situations. And all of those conversations are part of what's going on in these lesson plans. So just a few more words on Bella Abzug. She had a prolific career in Congress. She sponsored the Equal Rights Amendment and the Equal Credit Act. She worked on Title IX and co-founded the National Women's Political Caucus. She also introduced the first federal bill to support gay and lesbian civil rights in Congress, and co-authored the Freedom of Information Act, and was the first to call for the impeachment of President Nixon. So really prolific career there. And after she left Congress, she did a lot of work with the international community and the international women's community. After she presided over the first National Women's Conference in Houston in 1997, she went on to form grassroots political organizations, and the international women's conferences, and then she hoped co-found WEDO, which was the Women's Environmental and Development Organization. Yes, and Marilyn's pointing out she was also part of the group of Jewish women who had a yearly women's Seder. So now what we're going to do is we're going to do a little text study, and we're going to look at an excerpt of an interview that Bella Abzug gave about the iconic hats that she wore. So go ahead and take a minute to read this and post your sort of immediate observations or what you notice in the chat. I'll give you a minute or two. Lynn commenting that she loves her sense of humor. Yeah, she definitely had that going for her as well, and used it. So I want to ask a question now about this, which is, so we're going to compare Esther and Bella Abzug a little bit. So how would you compare the way that they used appearance to get power? How are they similar and how are they different? I see a bunch of people writing in. That's great. So yes, they both used their appearance to get noticed, right? So there's something about, part of getting power is having the attention of somebody. What else? Yeah, so they both understood that their appearance made a difference in the way that people respond to them. And they didn't just understand that it made a difference, but they understood how, right? So here Bella Abzug is explicitly saying, so in those days, professional women wore hats and gloves. So I put on gloves and hats. She knew that if she wanted to be taken seriously, she had to dress the part. Just like Esther knew if the king was going to call on her and invite her, up to his throne, she had to look a certain way. Linan saying, neither originally went out thinking about their looks, though they sort of figured it out or had to figure it out. Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I love these discussions because it's stuff that I hadn't thought about before. So, yeah, they didn't set out on the journey and say, like, I'm going to get really pretty so I can be the queen, or I'm going to wear a hat so that I can do what I want. They both looked at the situation, saw that the situation required something that they needed to change, and they used what they could change, which was something about themselves, in order to get the opportunities that they needed. And that's a really great point. What else? What about how? Let me see. So the next question is, when might choosing an appearance of conformity support your larger goals, and when might it undermine your goals? So thinking about this tactic of dressing the part in order to get things done, when does it support the work and when might it undermine the work? Let's draw out that sort of like complicated piece of it. Does it? I think that's another question, is does it ever undermine the goals? I think that relates to the question before. If you're being strategic by being manipulative, is there ever a time where that really isn't so great? Yeah, and actually let me if I put it up in writing, it'll be easier. So looking at this second question here. So Marilyn is saying, for Esther's beauty or Bella's hats, there's still a need to be taken seriously, which both those things can undermine. Yeah, so part of it is that could backfire, or could say, oh, Esther's just a pretty face, right? She doesn't really have anything of value to offer. Is that what you're saying, Marilyn? What else? Is there ever a time um, where having to make change in this way by sort of changing or transforming or manipulating yourself is actually working against the end goal? Samara saying, not dressing the part can cause one to be dismissed or not taken seriously. Yeah, and sort of prettying up is what got Esther into the palace. Um, yeah, and Marilyn raising this point of not wanting to be stereotyped. So, I think that I think especially for women, I think both Bella Abzug and Esther were walking a very fine line of how do I conform to the expectations of society without going too far into the other end and actually losing the power that I have. And I think that that's something that we all kind of grapple with in some ways, regardless of gender, in thinking about, how do we both meet expectations and push the envelope? Um, and Lynn Ann saying, sometimes it's easier to change from the inside than from the outside. You need to conform enough to get in before you can start getting changes made. Yeah, and so maybe part of thinking about change is, what is the turning point? If we're starting by making change by these sort of dress the part tactics, at what point do we need to change that to start making real structural change that's addressing the fact that women have to dress a certain way to get power anyway, or that, Jews or young people or whatever, that people have to sort of manipulate to get power? When do we start addressing those pieces? And part of that is about, we have to get into the system enough in order to do it. Absolutely. Samara saying, sometimes it's not appropriate to try to fit a part. Can you give an example? And maybe some of the other participants here can give an example of, like, when is it not appropriate to try and fit a part? Yeah, so the example of trying to fit in with teens by dressing like them. I think that's a good example as someone who's done some teen education work. Also, trying to use like the hip lingo in order to get in. There's something about authenticity there, and if people feel like it's not authentic, you're really not going to get the power that you want. I think that's a great example. So I wanna leave us some time to talk a little bit more, but first I want to throw out these questions here. So here are some other uh, directions the conversation could go in, and these are from the teen and adult programs. So thinking about, how I, a student, decide what to wear. What are the pieces that impact those decisions? Um, Thinking about how I dress in different situations, or when I want to have a specific role, how I change the way that I look or I act in order to do that. Um, and having, I think, some critical discussion around that and around the role that clothes and identity play. Um, so I have a couple, I'll share with you in a minute a couple ideas of sort of more directions or additional pieces that you could build off of this program. But what I want to do is take 5 or 10 minutes here for us to just sort of chat together about um, how this fits, sort of to share your ideas and questions about how this fits into your curriculum. And this doesn't have to be like, this is not a commitment to what you're going to go now and teach now that you've come to this program. But I want us to think a little bit creatively about how you could or might carry the ideas or stories forward that we've learned about. And what questions you would want to explore with your community. So let's use the chat or the audio talking feature to sort of just talk practically about how some of these ideas and sources might be implemented in our settings. So Lynn Ann writing in and saying that she recently had a discussion about the parsha and about sort of the function of the priests and how they dressed, and this could be an extension of that discussion. Yeah, absolutely, that's a great example. Um, Marilyn saying she'd like to explore the issue of how one is seen, how one dresses can be brought into Torah study when oh, yeah, when talking about what the high priest had to wear, maybe bringing that up. So you guys, took me a while, I was reading it, but you guys are on exactly the same page. Samara adding it could also be talking about sort of what ritual garb people are wearing your talit, wearing a kippah, perhaps laying tefillin or having a Star of David necklace, and sort of when do we wear those? Why do we wear them? What does it say about our role in the community? Yeah, different dress for different times. And thinking, I think in exploring that sort of different dress from different times situation, I think it's really important to push your students to be explicit about what they mean, why they're doing that, what does it mean that they're wearing certain clothes and making those choices. Um, Lynn Ann is saying this would also tie in really well with the piece from the High Holiday sermon on the JW site, yes, about wearing the yarmulke. So in our in the Living the Legacy curriculum, we have a piece of a sermon about why a rabbi decided to wear his yarmulke when he was being involved in civil rights activism. So this could really tie into that, and about that piece is really about what community am I representing and what ideas am I representing when I'm in communities outside of my own. Um, Also could tie it into resistance fighters in the Holocaust curriculum. Yeah, Samara, say a little bit more about that. That sounds like a great idea. Um, and Marilyn saying, dressing in particular ways can help people see who you really are, but it can also mask who you are. And I think that that dichotomy is a really important question to draw, especially with um, teens. I think really people of all ages deal with this, but bringing those questions out and talking about it. I know that I have a younger sister who's a teenager, and she really feels like the way that she dresses is the way that she's able to articulate who she is. And I think some critical conversation about when is it about identity and when is it about conformity, and like if it's bad or if it doesn't matter, and having some conversations about that is a great way to continue this conversation from the Purim story. Okay, so Samara writing in and saying, looking at different ways to resist the norm. Um, yeah, and I'll show you in a minute some of the other sites or resources that we have, but looking at the idea of resistance and how does appearance or the way that we dress um, sort of relate to resistance or rebellious action. Um, for me, that gives me an idea around this last question here, what contemporary stories or resources you might bring in. There are a lot of places, France most notably, that has laws around what religious garb you're allowed to wear. So maybe reading an article about that and having some conversation about how the way that you dress can be a radical act, I think is really interesting. There are probably some great examples also of Muslim Americans or other people who have sort of very prominent ways of religious dress, um, especially post 9/11, have chosen or not chosen to wear those garments, and talking about that a little bit. Samara also writing in and asking, discussing when does one stand up for the good of the community even if there's personal risk? And Naomi saying, and exploring how this relates to respect. Yeah, and I think that those conversations too, the personal risk piece was certainly part of what we were talking about with Esther. I think it definitely could be explored more in the Bella Abzug piece. Vashti is a really good example of like there was real personal risk, and she was that was like enacted on her. I'm sorry, I'm struggling with my words right now, but that was a risk that she took, and the outcome wasn't as positive as it was when Esther took a risk. So thinking about how you take those risks is important. And great, Naomi expanding a little bit on how these ideas relate to respect and thinking about respect for ourselves, respect for the community, respect for the place where we are, how we dress for services or prayer. And that could even go more onto like ideas about holy space and holiness and what makes our students feel connected to the community or to their source of prayer or to God. There's some great conversations I think that can be had there. So if you all have other ideas, it seems like the ideas are slowing down, feel free to type them in the chat. I just want to mention some of the extensions that these 3 lesson plans that are in Go and Learn do have. So 2 of the lesson plans also bring in, I felt like 3 different stories was a lot of stories to do in an hour online. But we have a This Week in History article on our site about Bess Meyerson, who was the first and only Jewish woman to win the Miss America pageant. Her story is really interesting, and at the time when she won, she wasn't particularly well received by sort of the broader community. There are some pieces in the story about her decision not to change her name to a stage name, but instead to use Bess Meyerson as her very Jewish sounding last name. So I think that bringing in that piece gives even more concrete example of the decisions that we make, and also about different pieces of our identity, not just how we dress, but also our name, the community that we come from. Like those pieces are all sort of inextricable, and also we can choose to share them or not share them, and talking about sort of the implications of that. There's also in the a little bit in the teen program and a lot in the adult program, a discussion of the challenges that are faced by women in society today and how women adapt or don't adapt different personas or dress a certain way to help them leverage power. And I think that there are a lot of contemporary examples of this. Students will know a lot about this, so this could be a great opportunity to sort of bring in a piece of pop culture to have a critical discussion about the community, like your own community, and the way that appearance and identity sort of and power play out in your community. Yeah, going back, Naomi making the point that I forgot to mention at the beginning, which is Esther's name was also changed, that the given name was Hadassah. So that could be a really great parallel to bring in with the Esther and Bess Myerson piece and thinking about that. And especially, I know a lot of people do activities around students learning their names and learning the story of their name and how they were given those names and thinking about what your name means to you as part of your identity. There's some great stuff there. The family education program has a little theater enactment of the Bella Abzug situation, and then has parents and kids dress up in different costumes as sort of different professions or kinds of people, and then guessing what the person is dressed as. So the family education, which is really for younger kids, isn't going to this sort of discussion about society. It's about first helping them recognize just plainly that the way that we dress says something about who we are. So it's it's the same topic, but at a different and age appropriate level. Um, and the last thing in the teen program is a discussion of how we choose to dress. And there's this piece, it's an excerpt from a New York Times article about a boy who started wearing a poncho. And it has his dad talking about him wearing this poncho, and then him talking about wearing this poncho. And the dad says, oh, I think he likes it, and it's because he wants to be an individual and it's his style. And then the son saying, well, I wore it once or twice, and then everyone kept expecting me to wear it, and it's actually just easier to wear it and not have to deal with people asking questions about it. And I really love that last text piece because I think that that's something that we all struggle with, and it so explicitly sort of lays it out there. I think it's a great conversation starter, and a good way to sort of explore that gray area between what's a choice that I'm making and what's a choice that I'm making for myself, and a choice that really doesn't feel like a choice because it's about conforming or meeting people's expectations. And that, I think, relates a little bit to what we were talking about with Esther and with Bella Abzug deciding to wear hats so that she looked professional and people would take her seriously. What other ideas or questions do you all have? We have about 5 minutes left before the hour is up, so if people have other things that they would like to add to this conversation, now is the time. Okay, so thank you all for coming today. This was a really fantastic discussion. I really appreciated your contributions. I know it can be a little bit tricky to use the chat box, but it was really great to have all of you. I hope that you will use some of this stuff in your communities, and feel free to write in and let us know how it went. I should make one mention of the fact Miriam will post the link to the National Educators Network in the chat. That's our Facebook group. Some of you are already members of the group. And I will just say that in March, we're going to be having a kind of photo contest where for every photo you post of you and your students learning about Jewish women during Women's History Month, you will be entered in a raffle, and we're going to be giving away 3 poster sets of our Women of Valor posters. So if you're using this for Purim, or you're doing some other stuff for Women's History Month, or you're already teaching about women in your lesson plan during March, feel free to post a picture to our Facebook group, and you can be entered to win one of those poster sets. If you want the posters, you can get them, so post a picture. That's it. We'll send you all follow-up emails. Have a wonderful weekend, and we hope to see you again at one of our future online learning programs.